Alrighty then. Hello and welcome to question and answer number 152. I am your host, Panyo Basa. And 152, of course, is pathetically non-prime. This is my beverage. And we're doing a late one. This is the most late night question and answer I've ever done. Pretty sure. It's well after midnight, and long before this Q&A is done, that fish tank back there is going to be completely turned off. It's already in moonlight mode. Because I've been kind of busy today. The fish tank is very close to being finished. The digging is done. I put down the liner today. Found out that one end of the pond where the overflow is going to be is like 6 inches too low, so I have to do some masonry, mixed up some concrete, and built that up. And so probably maybe a week from now it'll be done and even have like fish in it and stuff, which is kind of nice. I like fish ponds. So I guess I should just start answering questions. It's going to be like after 3 in the morning probably by the time I'm done. But I'm kind of a night owl. I'm more nocturnal than most people anyway. So, first question is from Gnostic Rocker. And Gnostic Rocker actually asked these questions last February in an email that I overlooked. And so he has the privilege of asking more than 3 questions this time, because the first 3 questions he asked were several months ago. So anyways, Gnostic Rocker says, can you tell us about any fantastically insightful, ostensibly mad, or deeply eccentric one-off kinds of people you've met in the temples in your time in Burma? While staying in hermitages over the years since the late 1980s, I soon realized it was far better to suspend judgment for a while. Some of the people I initially considered half mad turned out to be full of spiritual insight, some of them deeply original. Some of the somewhat wacky eccentrics turned out to have brilliant gems of wisdom, whilst conversely, some whom I'd initially considered profound, it turned out were just mouthing cliches and following orders by the book. So let's just get back up towards the question mark. Can you tell us about any fantastically insightful, ostensibly mad, or deeply eccentric one-off kinds of people you've met in the temples in your time in Burma? Well, I mean, it should be pointed out that really saintly people tend to be rather nutty. They tend to be very eccentric. I mean, that's just the way it is. Like William James, in his classic book, The Varieties of Religious Experience, starts off by pointing out that saints, like medieval kind of saints, because he was mainly talking within the context of Western civilization and Christianity, that saintly people would be considered mentally ill nowadays. A lot of them, probably most of them. And so good monks tend to be rather strange. In fact, monks in general, especially Western monks, tend to be kind of on the fringe anyhow. Because like a Western monk is just kind of deviating from his entire culture in order to adopt Buddhism. Unless maybe he was born and raised in a Buddhist ashram or something. So nevertheless, most monks, most people who live at monasteries, they're not enlightened. They're going to have plenty of foibles. And most of the really nutty kind of monks, they were just kind of nutty to the point of being somewhat dysfunctional. Like there was a Chinese Malaysian monk who was just very confused. I mean, it's like he could not make up his mind about stuff. And he had this habit of like walking into my room. I met him first in Rangoon at a meditation center in Rangoon, and then I met him again at a forest monastery in central Burma. And he did the same thing twice, where like he needs help with his visa. And he just gets this idea that somehow I can help him with his visa. So he'll just walk into my presence and then just stand there in silence with his back to me until I ask him, what do you want? And then he'll ask if I can help with his visa. But he starts off just walking into the room. There's just the two of us, and then he'll just stand there with his back to me in silence until I address him, and then he'll say what's on his mind. There was another Vietnamese monk that I met at a forest monastery who, I mean, he hadn't been in Burma for very long. And I had been in Burma for well over 10 years at the time, but still he had been to way more places than I have. He's just going to place after place after place, and none of them is satisfactory. And he's asking me, where is a good place? Where is a good place? And I'm telling him, I mean, if you've been to that many places already and you still haven't found a good one, chances are the problem is not with the places. And he had this phobia of lay people. It was like if he was sitting in front of his cave and lay people came just to pay respects or something, he would just take off, hide in the cave for the rest of the day. I mean, he just, the lay people, I mean, he had this just mortal dread of interacting with lay people, except when he was like with his bowl in the village. And he was pretty much the same way. He just could not make up his mind about stuff. So, I mean, there's monks like that are just nutty. And it's not the good kind of nutty where you're just sort of, you know, you've kind of broken free from the samsaric wheel to some degree. You know, you're just kind of calling your own, you know, you're no longer enslaved to a lot of cultural conditioning that most people are enslaved to, that sort of thing. That's kind of a good sort of eccentric. But there are probably most of the nutty inhabitants of monasteries are sort of the other kind, where, I mean, they are on the fringe, you know, they're more able, I suppose, to renounce the world and strive for enlightenment or whatever, but also it's just they're kind of dysfunctional. So, I mean, some of the dysfunctional types also became canonized as Catholic saints, like Saint Gertrude, for example. I mean, there was a lot of medieval saints. They're just like hallucinating, hearing voices and seeing stuff all the time. But Saint Teresa of Avila, I've mentioned her before, where she was seeing visions so often that her father confessor just told her to make the sign of the cross every time you see a vision. And it was tiring out her arm, apparently. So she just started carrying a crucifix and just like holding it up every time she saw one, or heard the voices or whatever. But with regard to like really eccentric monks that were relatively highly advanced, there's one in particular, and he was an American. He was from Texas. His name was Waithariza Bhikkhu. In fact, he had his name legally changed to Vesaraja Bhikkhu. In Burmese pronunciation, it'd be Waithariza Bhikkhu. And then after he'd been a monk for like 14, 15 years, something like that, he dropped out of the monkhood and became a kind of recluse. He still wore monk's robes, still went for alms round. Sometimes he grew his hair long and had a beard just so he wouldn't be accused of pretending to be a monk. And he lived in a big hollow tree, a huge banyan tree. I've sat inside that hollow banyan tree with him. You know, it was sort of like maybe 8 feet long and maybe like 3 or 4 feet wide. So you could stand up in it. So it was plenty enough room to live in there. And he was sort of like a Buddhist Rambo that I've probably mentioned him before on these Q&As, where I had a friend of his tell me before I ever met Waithariza that most Buddhists, when they're trying to walk the middle path, they stray over into the self-indulgent side. Whereas Waithariza is one of the few that I've come across that strays the other way into like the self-torture side, or just excess. You know, his lute strings were too tight instead of too loose. that kind of thing. But he was held up as like the just sort of the role model. You know, he was kind of my hero before I ever met him, because the Burmese monks would all be praising. He was ordained in the same tradition as me, the Tampulu tradition. He was ordained by Tampulu Sayadaw himself, and he was just held up as this role model for me to emulate when I was a junior monk. And he was just completely strict with regard to Vinaya. I think I mentioned before the story of one time he was in America, and he was asked to give a Dhamma talk at this monastery and where he was already staying, so he didn't have to go anywhere. So at the time of the Dhamma talk, he just comes in and sits down, and he just sits there in silence for like 5 minutes. And after sitting there in silence for 5 minutes, he just gets up and walks out. So then the organizer of the retreat, who invited him to talk at this, you know, it's sort of like the Dhamma talk, the evening Dhamma talk, she chases after him and asks him, why didn't you say anything? And he said, well, there was somebody there wearing a stocking cap, and it is against Vinaya for a monk to teach Dhamma to someone who has their head covered. And it was like the middle of winter time, and there was one of the women there had like a stocking cap on. So, I mean, it was easily rectified. They just went and asked her to take the stocking cap off, and then Uwe Theresa came back and gave the Dhamma talk. But he was trying too hard, I think. You know, his strings were too tight instead of too loose like most people. And he just kind of, I mean, it was like at the surface level, he dropped out of the monkhood, and he started kind of criticizing Dhamma a lot. You know, he once said that, in his opinion, the Buddha was just sort of like an ancient Indian Joseph Goldstein, this kind of thing. But deeper down, you could tell that he still had faith, that he was just sort of at the surface rationalizing. And I guess he's still alive. I think he's living in Burma still, last I heard, which was just a few months ago. But he really did try too hard. He was trying to do all of the 13 Dhutangas at the highest level, which, I mean, in ancient India, only Mahakassapa could do it. You know, it was like only one monk could do the Dhutangas at the highest level, according to tradition. And now he was like the Buddha's successor, as senior member of the Sangha after the Buddha attained Parinibbana. Here's Uwe Theresa trying to do all of the Dhutangas at the highest level. And he just had sleep deprivation. He kind of cracked up one time because, I mean, he was trying to sleep. I mean, one of the Dhutangas is you never lie down. And you've got 3 different levels for each Dhutanga. The hardest level of the sitting Dhutanga is you're not even allowed to lean back against anything. You're not allowed to sit in a chair. You just have to be like sitting as in meditation, sleeping that way. And he did fudge a little bit. He put his alms bowl in front of him and leaned forwards, resting his forehead on his alms bowl. But still, he wasn't getting enough sleep, and he eventually kind of cracked up because of that. Got sent back to America, and as soon as he got better, he just came right back to Burma again and reordained and just went at it again. But he was one of the most eccentric, advanced practitioners that I ever really had any dealings with. But just about any kind of monk is going to be at least a little bit eccentric, especially the Western ones. So let's see here. Let's see. I'm trying to think of any advanced kind of nutty Burmese monks, but I didn't really interact much with other monks when I was in Burma. Western monks, it's interesting to talk to Western monks because, you know, they have interesting insights, and there's no culture barrier, no language barrier, that sort of thing. Whereas Burmese monks, they tend to think pretty much alike. They tend to have pretty much the same interpretation of Dhamma with just minor variations. You know, it's sort of like talking about Christianity to a medieval European. You know, they all have just been indoctrinated since like toddlerhood about, what to believe. This is the true belief. This is what you have to believe in order not to burn in hell, that kind of thing. The Burmese, to some degree, are still like that. So I think I answered that question, at least to the best of my memory at present. And so I'm just going to move on to Gnostic Rockers' second question of last February, which is, have you ever met Korean Zen monks in Theravada temples? Many of the Korean Zen monks I have met have profound respect for Vipassana, particularly the Mahasi Sayadaw approach. And yeah, I met one Korean Zen monk in particular. I assume he was Zen. He was wearing like gray pajamas when he arrived at Panditarama. I was doing a 2-month intensive retreat at Panditarama in Rangoon. And there was this Korean Buddhist monk there, Mahayana monk of some sort, wearing gray pajamas. And he was very serious. He was very friendly, very nice person. He definitely had deep faith and respect for Dhamma, including Theravada. And he didn't like, though, that he was treated like a layperson because he's wearing the gray pajamas. He's not a bhikkhu. He's not a ponji in Burmese. That he's seen as sort of like a member of some other religion. And so he got to go first in line after the monks, before the regular lay people, but still he went after the monks, like going for, going into the refectory to eat the morning meal or whatever. So he didn't like that. And so he was ordained as a bhikkhu at Panditarama without even disrobing from being a Zen monk, which is probably against the rules. According to my understanding, it would be against the rules. I mean, you'd have to disrobe from being a Zen monk before you can be ordained as a Theravada bhikkhu. Because, just the whole wrong view thing, that kind of thing. So he was a deep meditator. He got praised by U Pandita a lot, although listening to him at meditation retreats, it was surreal. He's talking about, his body just dissolving into particles, and he's flying through the sky, lighter than air, just on and on. It sounded like he was having some kind of acid trip while he was meditating, and he would just sit like a statue for 3 hours straight. He could his legs would just flop into the full lotus position. He'd just sit there motionless for 3 hours. Although, I'm not exactly sure the value of his meditation, considering that it was really psychedelic experiences that he was continually having. But he was a serious practitioner. I have no doubt that he was more advanced than most Dhamma practitioners. And he and I would talk a lot about Nagarjuna, Majjhimaka, and he would say that according to his tradition, Nagarjuna is like a second Buddha, this kind of thing. So it was kind of interesting talking to him about that, although we did keep talking to a minimum because we were in an intensive meditation retreat. So every once in a while we might talk a little bit, but as a general rule at a Mahasi retreat, you're supposed to be looking down, moving in slow motion, not talking to anybody except for the Sayadaw who's interviewing you, that kind of thing. So in a way, it's kind of like a thought reform camp. There are similarities. I don't need to get into this, but there are similarities. So let's see. I think I answered that question. So I'm just going to move on to Gnostic Rocker's third question of last February. And wait a minute. Yeah, I'm lagging and I don't have the computer plugged in. Just a second. I have to move to a different desk, and sometimes I forget this. Just a second. We're having technical difficulties. Okay. All right. I'm still lagging though. That's not good. Yeah. Maybe it'll catch up eventually. So, the third question from Gnostic Rocker is, since you live in the Bible Belt, what do you think Christians really believe in? That's kind of an interesting question. So, what Christians really believe in, especially in the Bible Belt, like South Carolina, where I'm living now, it's hard to say. I mean, I'm not really. I've never been a Christian, so it's just sort of like an anthropological observation thing for me to try to answer this question. But like, I've had two bosses before this present job. The two jobs I had before the present job I'm working at were devout Christian bosses. The first one was an ordained minister, in fact, although he decided to be the manager of the sheet metal shop instead of preaching to a congregation, I guess. And, you know, he would say grace before he would eat a meal. And he believed the Bible, I assume, although at the same time, he would talk about like shooting trespassers. You know, it's like he'd be going into gory detail about blowing holes and people breaking into his house, although it didn't really happen. You know, but if it did happen, he was going to blow holes through that person, which is not particularly Christian. And then the second boss I had, really nice guy. He wouldn't swear. You know, that was like an obvious thing about him. And he knew his Bible. But one thing about Christians is they really don't care much about the whole gather not up your treasures upon the earth stuff. Like the whole renunciation of the world that you find in the New Testament that Jesus taught, and like you should be poor. Very few Christians take that seriously in America, as far as I can tell. So like forgiving your enemies, they might have to admit that they can't do it, but you know, they'll say, yeah, that's right. You should forgive your enemies, and you know, you should like uphold basic morality, that kind of thing. And at least they have that as an ideal. Except for like the not gathering up treasures upon the earth. There's a few other ones, I suppose. You know, there's just a few things. It's the same in Buddhism, where there's some precepts or teachings that are so inconvenient for like a modern layperson living in the world, you know, in the world and of the world, that that's one reason that Christianity has survived this long, is that it doesn't really require Christians to fully follow the teachings of Jesus. So, I mean, you know, selling all that you have, giving the money to the poor, and then taking up your cross and wandering around, casting out demons and healing the sick and that sort of thing. I mean, that is just, it's sort of like in Buddhism, renouncing the world and just sleeping under trees, that kind of thing. It's just, in order for it to become like a national religion, then, I mean, it has to get watered down a lot. But for the most part, a lot of Christians in South Carolina, you know, they know their Bible, they read the Bible, they'll say grace before meals, you know, they'll refrain from cussing and so forth. But still, it's just sort of like a Christian flavored worldly layperson as a general rule. And like Buddhists in the West are kind of the same. It's like a Buddhist flavored worldly layperson. So I think what American Christians in the Bible Belt really believe, I mean, they believe in Jesus. You know, Jesus is their savior. You just believe in Jesus. I mean, that's like the main thing, I think. believing in Jesus is more important than actually living a saintly life, pretty obviously. And it does seem like I caught up on the lag and then I started lagging again, and I'm not exactly sure what the problem is. And we've already been going for well over 20 minutes, so I don't want to just start over. So this could be like a shitty recording for all I know. And I'm just going to move on to Hooligan Rocker, who is actually the same person as Gnostic Rocker. He just changed his name since February. But I guess this way it kind of is a pass for asking 3 more questions, because really, in all fairness, he asked the first 3 in February and I just kind of overlooked them when I was compiling questions that time, and it just didn't happen. So Hooligan Rocker says, when you were a monk, were you ever allowed to develop meaningful, deep friendships with other monks, or would that have been considered attachment of a worldly kind? If the answer is no, wouldn't that be a lonely existence? But maybe that otherworldly state of being is an axiomatic given within monasticism anyway. Well, I did have friends. I had Burmese friends, a few are just monastic friends. I had some Western friends, including Uwaithariza, who was kind of a friend, but he was definitely like a hermit. But I mean, I'd hang out with him sometimes, and you know, it was interesting. But let's see here. Were you ever allowed to develop meaningful, deep friendship? Yeah, I mean, monks being friends is certainly not forbidden in the text. It is, in fact, encouraged if you find a friend who is wise and helps you in your practice, that sort of thing. So, yeah, I mean, it is allowed to develop meaningful, deep friendships with other monks. You know, it is praised in the texts, but I've always been pretty much of a loner, and so I really didn't have a lot of friends, and sometimes, you know, it's just, you just move on, move in different directions. You don't see the other person anymore. So, but if the answer is no, wouldn't that be a lonely existence? Well, I guess that's an extra question, isn't it? I mean, it depends on the person. I mean, some people are just reclusive. It's, I remember living near that, the Texan hermit who lived in the hollow tree was an Australian monk. And I was sort of intermediate between them with regard to my tolerance for conversation. Like the hermit monk Uwaithariza, he would just burn out on conversation pretty fast. He just did not like human companionship very much at all. Whereas the Australian monk, I started avoiding that monastery just because he would be talking all the time. You know, he'd be just kind of dropping by under some pretext and then just sort of holding forth, just talking about all kinds of stuff, sometimes about Dhamma, but as often as not, it would be, you know, this really great cricket bat that he had, or motorcycle accident that he got in when he was a teenager or some such. Or how he was like rewiring something and just going into long detail, not really caring, or it didn't occur to him that maybe another person wouldn't want to hear a 20-minute long monologue about troubleshooting the wiring in like a circuit box or something. So I was sort of intermediate, that I would burn out on conversation with the Australian monk first, but if I was hanging out with Uwaithariza, the Texan monk, he would burn out first. So people just have a different need for human companionship, a different need for talking, and I am kind of at the lower end. Like, I really don't. At work, there's some people that are just talking all the time. They talk to everybody, and pretty much the only people I talk to are the people who talk to everybody, because they're talking to me because I'm part of everybody. But for the most part, I just do not engage in any kind of like sociality. I'm just not a gregarious person. So I guess I'm just going to move on to Hooligan Rocker's second question. And it does kind of concern me a little bit that this video is sort of lagging and then catching up and then lagging again. I assume it was because I didn't plug in the computer and it was working on a battery that was barely keeping up. And I don't know, but it seems to be doing okay now. Anyways, Hooligan Rocker, formerly known as Gnostic Rocker, says, do you ever feel depression, or has Buddhist consciousness lessened that very human tendency? And depression runs on both sides of my family. And so, I mean, I have been relatively seriously depressed a few times in my life, at least twice when I was a monk. I mean, the two worst depressions I had were both when I was a monk. And, I mean, I won't go into details, but I was seriously depressed. Not like incapacitated, not just like lying in the fetus position, just wanting to sleep all day, that kind of thing. But still, I mean, it was unpleasant. And the thing is, part of the thing is that my consciousness expands and contracts, kind of like the Buddhist cosmos, but a lot faster. And with probably less regularity, you're able to predict it less, I guess. So, I mean, that kind of runs in the family, and I think that is pretty much what depression is about. In this case, it just seems to be like constitutional factors. You know, it just runs on both sides of the family, at least going with like a scientific, you know, genetic kind of explanation, that it's my consciousness kind of expands and contracts. And when I was a monk, and it was in a contracted phase, I wasn't necessarily like in a state that most people would call depression, but I was vulnerable to that. And it was like, you're not really interested in anything. Meditation becomes almost impossible when you're in a state like this, when your mind is just sort of contracted. It's like trying to meditate, trying to keep your mind on the object is like trying to balance a marble on the tip of a sharpened pencil. I mean, it's practically impossible. On the other hand, my consciousness is more expansive, and I assume this is sort of like bipolar, but I'm not clinically significant. Like mental illnesses, as a general rule, tend to be exaggerations of normal states. You know, there's like a spectrum of, you know, just how far along you are. And so with regard to bipolar or manic depression, as it used to be called, you know, I'm kind of maybe a little farther than most people in that direction, although not enough that they need to lock me up in a padded room or anything, or I don't have to take lithium or anything like that. But you can just feel it. Just sometimes the consciousness is contracted, sometimes it's expanded. And when I'm expanded, it's like Dhamma is more interesting. Meditation can be so easy that it's practically effortless. And so, I mean, I did learn through mindfulness, just being mindful of what your own mind is doing, you know, how you're feeling, that sort of thing, that I could sort of, I wouldn't say brace myself against depression, but you could take precautions. Like if I'm in like a contracted state, there are certain things I learned that help to kind of hold full-blown depression at bay. One is just sleep a little extra, sleep a little more than usual. Another thing is just accomplish something every day, even if it's just like cleaning your cave, cleaning your room. Just accomplish something positive every day so you don't just feel like the whole day was just a stagnating waste. Because that helps the depression to feel as your life is just stagnating, you're not accomplishing anything. So definitely it does help to just do something positive every day if you feel like your mind is sort of getting contracted and you're sort of feeling vulnerable to possible depression. So I'm much more resistant to it now than I was as a layperson before I was a monk or as a junior monk. The last really serious depression I had was I had been a monk for about 10 years, and I've talked about that. I've even I think it might even be in one of my books, a discussion of that. So still I feel like the expansion and contraction And sometimes, when I'm in a contracted state, I'm just more flat, more blah, just less effusive, less talkative, that kind of thing, which my woman, sometimes she just thinks that something is wrong. And I try to explain, it's just, I'm going through a contracted phase and then it gets expansive again. And, that's just the way it is. And because there is no self, you can't really make it be otherwise. You cannot say with regard to your own consciousness, let it be this way, let it not be that way, and reliably have it happen. So I'll just move on to the next question from Hooligan Rocker, which I won't answer because I already answered it, because the third question from Hooligan Rocker is the same as the first question from Gnostic Rocker, which is about the deeply inspiring or really eccentric monks you met over the decades you were in robes. I guess it's slightly different because he's emphasizing the deeply inspiring rather than the really eccentric. But I don't know. Every once in a while you'd meet a monk in Burma that, some old Seattle who seemed like he really gets it. He seems like he's attained something, but sometimes you can be mistaken. It's like first time I met Tenjidon Seattle, Venerable Tenjidon Seattle, I thought, well, he might really have attained something. But then I went to a Tenjidon Seattle retreat in Pagan in Burma, and yeah, it was rather disillusioning. U Pandita was kind of the same way. It's like, he has attained something, or he had, he's passed away now. He had attained something, but still, he was just a really angry person. So, how enlightened is someone going to be when they get pissed off pretty much on a daily basis? But, that's kind of a philosophical question. I'm sure that his followers would say, well, it just goes to show that even a highly advanced Dhamma practitioner can get pissed off on a daily basis. So, there's like Yuamun Seattle. I met him a couple times. He got me into a bit of trouble, in fact. He was this old monk who lived in a cemetery. And the people around thought he was an Arahat. That's why I was brought to see him. You got to come see the Arahat. And, he was this monk who lived alone in a cemetery, in this little hut built on the edge of the cemetery. Very friendly. Gave me a bunch of Red Bull, like the Asian Red Bull that would probably be illegal in America nowadays. And, but that's it. It's like he's considered to be an Arahant, and he didn't do anything really unsaintly when I was there. And, it's like I liked him. There was something really likable about him. He's very sincere, but he liked me too, apparently. And so one time some people from a nearby village, from near the cave where I was living, they went to visit him. They rented this toilaji, it's called in Burmese. You see them a lot in Thailand too. I think it's called a tuk-tuk in Thailand. It's just sort of like this iron wagon that has like a lawnmower engine on the front of it. And sometimes you steer it with like handlebars, like a motorcycle. Sometimes it'll have a steering wheel, no suspension. It's just bone jarring to ride in one of these things. They rented one of these and went to visit Venerable Yuamun Seattle, the reputed Arahant. And when they told him where they were from, or when they told him where they were from, he said, "Oh, you live near that American monk. He's very venerable. You should make sure to put alms in his bowl, even if it's raining. You should be sure to make sure he has enough food." And so the day after that, I went to the nearby village for alms, and it was like a circus. And it was just so much people. There's no way it would all go into my bowl. It's like a tenth of it wouldn't go into my bowl. And so it was just like the people assumed, like, this Arahant says that this other monk is very venerable. That must mean that other monk is an Arahant too. So I got this reputation for being an Arahant because of Yuamun Seattle, at least in that area. And it was not, some people might think, oh, it'd be great to be famous. You get a lot of support, but there is such a thing as too much of a good thing. and just having like 100 people all lined up waiting to offer food when you've just got a bowl that's like this big. I mean, it's the same bowl that's back on the table there. Man, it was a headache. So let's see here. I guess I should just move on. The next question is from Kundru. And Kundru says, what is the worst physical pain that you've ever experienced? And that's kind of a strange question, because as a general rule, I think we tend to kind of block out memories like that of like the most unbearable agony. But then again, it's like if you really hurt yourself, it's like you go numb. You know, you get a really bad injury or something. And fortunately, I haven't really had a really horrible, you know, I haven't been maimed or anything yet. So when I read this question, what is the worst physical pain that you've ever experienced? There's one memory came to mind. And that was, I was living under the big rock ledge on the northern boundary of Alondo Kathapa National Park. And I felt like I was starting to catch a cold. So I asked for a couple lemons. I was going to get vitamin C from eating these lemons. And I just ate the lemons like they were oranges. And then, like, that evening, and for a few days afterwards, when I tried to brush my teeth, it was just this searing pain. It was like a pain like I've never felt before. It was just, my face would just start sweating. It was just like this exquisite agony from my teeth becoming so sensitized from the acid from the lemon juice that I ate, from the lemon that I ate. It was weird. It took a few days, like 3 days, for it to finally fade back out again. But try to brush my teeth, like after eating that lemon, and seriously, I mean, it was like, I don't know. It was like some kind of torture. It was really weird. But I've probably experienced worse physical pain than that, and I just can't think of what it is. Just because, as a general rule, you don't want to think about that kind of stuff. You know, it's just human nature. I mean, there are some people that have like a morbid kind of personality trait where they'll just kind of dwell on that kind of thing, which helps them to be depressed or whatever. But in my case, I really can't think of like really exquisite agony that I've experienced physically. Emotionally, it's always, you know, at the business end of an angry female or something, but generally one's lover. But yeah, I guess it would be the thing that really comes to mind would be, you know, trying to brush my teeth after eating a lemon. Although, I mean, every once in a while, I have had dental work done with no anesthesia in Burma. So, I mean, that's kind of painful too. But it wasn't just this exquisite, searing agony that just caused my face to just sweat. Oh, just, I guess that's all I can think of. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from CO of Action, Sipad Zidana. And CO of Action, Sipad Zidana says, you said sometimes you might have to sacrifice your own virtue for the greater good, but the Dhammapada says, don't sacrifice your own welfare for that of another, no matter how great. Realizing your own true welfare, be intent on just that. And that's verse 166 from the Dhammapada. And then he says, thoughts? And I can see that we're lagging again. So, I mean, I don't know if I ever really said that you might have to sacrifice your own virtue for the greater good. But, I mean, you may choose to do that. And it's everyone's right to choose, I suppose. Like, you know, I've said that the soldier, especially a Buddhist soldier, could be viewed as like a tragic hero who sacrifices his own virtue for the sake of others. And, I mean, how else is a Buddhist culture going to justify or even respect soldiers who are protecting their borders, for example? So, I mean, sometimes to sacrifice your own welfare for that of another, I mean, like spiritually you may be getting welfare when physically you're taking a hit. Like there's the story, I think it's a Mahayana story, of the Buddha as a bodhisattva or bodhisattva in a previous life, how he sees a tigress who is starving to death, and so he offers his own body to the tigress so that she won't starve to death, and she eats him, and he goes to heaven or something afterwards. So I mean, like at a physical level, you could be sacrificing your own welfare while still getting spiritual benefit. But still, I mean, this kind of attitude, like found in the Dhammapada, I mean, it can be taken to the extreme of sort of like the monk who just sits on a riverbank and watches a pretty girl drown because it's against the rules for him to touch a pretty girl. And in a case like that, then yeah, I think you might be better off breaking the rule and maybe even, feeling unwholesome feelings. I mean, some monks are so desperate that touching a pretty girl, even if she's like semi-unconscious, might be pleasant, even though he's not going to act upon any sensual desires that happen to arise or some such. But yeah, I mean, it can be taken to an extreme that you're not going to sacrifice your own welfare for another to the point of just being like, I don't know, just sort of like stingy, being a kind of ass, insensitive ass, that kind of thing. I don't know. But I don't think you necessarily have to sacrifice your own virtue for the greater good, but it may be a choice that you have to make sometimes. So anyways, I'm just going to move on to Seal of Action, Sipad Zidana's next question. Lagging as I am again. I catch up every now and then, though. Why did the Buddha want the Sangha to stay in touch with the common person and depend on them for food when normies ruin everything and every community? Normies ruin every community? I think every community is composed of normies. I mean, that's what a community is. It's an accumulation of normies. As a general rule, I mean, you might have like an advanced spiritual community, off in some remote area, but the overwhelming majority of communities are composed almost exclusively of normies. But the thing is, the Buddha, he had, at least according to tradition, he had compassion. And he would tell his enlightened disciples, go out and preach the Dhamma for the benefit of the many. It's kind of like there's a lot of overlap between what Jesus was teaching, gather not up your treasures upon the earth and all that. Give no thought for tomorrow, what you will eat or where you will sleep. Common to both religions and pretty much ignored by both religions in most cases. So, I mean, the Buddha did that largely as a way of helping people, helping to raise the level of consciousness by having ascetics, samanas in plain sight. In fact, I mean, according to the tradition, that's what inspired the Buddha himself to renounce the world. This, like, you saw the four sights, the fourth sight that really caused him to make up his mind was the holy man, the renunciant monk. And in the Mangala Sutta, which has the 30, 30-something blessings, the exact number of blessings escapes me at the moment, seeing ascetics, seeing like homeless renunciants is one of the blessings of life. It's sort of keeping that in the consciousness of the culture. When you've got renunciants, I mean, if they just go off and hide in the forest, then they're not going to be helping society nearly as much. They're not going to be helping people who need help nearly as much. And also, they're going to have to get their own food by digging the ground and killing animals and that kind of thing, which is inappropriate by ancient North Indian standards. So that's the main reasons, I guess. And so I'm just going to move on to Seal of Action, Sipad Zidana's third question. which is as follows. Does Buddhism agree with Karl Schwab? Isn't it Klaus Schwab? Or are there two Schwabs? Anyways, he says, does Buddhism agree with Karl Schwab from the WEF that you will own nothing and you will be happy is the ideal? So does Buddhism agree with you will own nothing and you will be happy? For the advanced practitioners, yeah, and it's an overlap with Christianity where, like if you read the Acts of the Apostles in the New Testament, like the followers of Jesus in Jerusalem after Jesus was crucified, they were essentially a commune. It was communistic. They would donate all of their wealth to the group, and it would be distributed according to need. So, they didn't really own anything then. And if you're fully enlightened, there's no I, me, mine anyhow. So, communism like this, it doesn't work for normies because it's so much at variance with just normie human nature. It's so much at variance, in fact, that it can only be enforced at gunpoint. But for a very advanced spiritual community, then, yeah, that would be the way to go, I guess. That if you have a bunch of Arahats with no concept of I, me, mine, they're just naturally going to be a kind of anarcho-communism. Not like Antifa is trying to establish, but it would be like a genuine anarcho-communism because there'd be no I, me, mine. But most people have these ideas of I, me, mine, and they're much more willing to work for their own benefit and the benefit of their immediate family than they are for just anonymous comrades distributed throughout the country. So, Buddhism does agree that if you are very spiritually advanced, you will own nothing and you will be happy. But that's not going to apply to the average householder who just isn't ready for that. Regardless of how communistic governments try to force it on them, it just doesn't work very well. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Siddhartha Lohachita. And why his name is Siddhartha Coppermind, I don't know. Maybe Loha he's like interpreting it as red or something. Like the word for red is Lohita. Oh no, that's blood. Blood is Lohita. Anyways, Siddhartha Lohachita says, does competitiveness have anything positive? And then he has this little comment, or this sort of a commentary here. The Tibetan Lojong says, I will take the defeat upon myself and give the victory to others. Or quoting the Dhammapada, verse 201, conquest begets enmity. The conquered live in misery. The peaceful live happily, having renounced conquest and defeat. Yeah, that's like right out of the Pasura Sutta of the Atthakavagga also. So getting up to the question here, does competitiveness have anything positive? And I've been trying to think of something positive that you get from competitiveness. It might inspire you to be better. But the thing is, I've never been a particularly competitive person. I'd play card games, stuff like that. Like when I was in college, my roommate and I would play a game of cribbage every day, and the loser would have to wash the dishes. So, that kind of competitiveness, and then you can like tease the other person if you really beat them badly, that kind of thing. But from a spiritual point of view and competitiveness, it really, it can inspire you to do better. Sort of like if you're at a meditation retreat, you don't want to be the first person to change position or get up and walk out, that kind of thing. It's sort of like the other people around you kind of, it would like demean your dignity, something like that. If you just like were the first person to just get up because your legs were sore or something. So, something like that, maybe, but competitiveness, you're really comparing yourself with other people. And that is, that's bad karma. That's not good. That's a kind of mana. In fact, the word mana, which is usually translated as pride or conceit, literally means measuring. It's like you're measuring yourself up against others. So that in the Atthakavagga it says, if you consider yourself superior to others, that's mana. If you consider yourself to be inferior to others, that's also mana. And if you consider yourself to be equal to others, that's also mana, because all of them you are comparing yourself to other people, which you're not supposed to be doing, because ultimately there's no self to compare anyway. So, I mean, there might be some beneficial side effects of competitiveness, just in that it kind of inspires you to try harder and do your best. It might not be for the best reasons. You may have bad motives for being as good as you possibly can, but at least you're being as good as you possibly can. But if you can do that without comparing yourself to other people, I mean, myself, I've never been particularly competitive, but I do my best just because it's like the job you do is a reflection of your character, or it's like you're competing with your own self, trying to be better than what you were, that kind of thing. That would be a more wholesome kind of competitiveness, just competing against, what you have been. But still, you're better off not having any kind of mana, not comparing yourself to others, not even comparing yourself to yourself. But the question being, does competitiveness have anything positive? Then, yeah, the positive might be that it's kind of a bad motive for nevertheless causing you to try your best. Just try your best because that's what you should do, is a better reason for trying your best than trying your best in order to do better than these slobs next to you. So I'm just going to move on to Siddhartha Lohachita's next question. On one hand, I like competitiveness, perhaps my greatest attachment. At one point, in the past, I was a wrestler and I enjoyed winning, but I also understand that this whole modern world revolves around competing for women, money, and all kinds of unsatisfying things. Should men give up all competition? Well, competitiveness is a masculine trait. And so there have been moves by progressives to make like the workplace, like in business, big business, that kind of thing, less competitive, so that women will be able to compete better, because women are more agreeable. They're more inclined to kind of back down or not like stab somebody in the back. Well, I guess, they can be catty, that kind of thing. That's sort of a feminine trait, a stereotypical feminine trait. But genuine competitiveness tends to be more of a masculine trait. And so should men give up all competition? It's an unrealistic should, because it's just human nature. You can try to program it out of men, and then you wind up with a bunch of wimpy betas. Just toxic masculinity. You want to abolish toxic masculinity, you wind up with a bunch of feminized betas, which is pretty much a death knell for that society. So, should men give up all competition? Yeah, they should give up like all unwholesome mental states. They should give up all badness, which sounds nice. It's not going to happen anytime soon. So it's just kind of it's kind of a silly should. Should men gather not up their treasures upon the earth? Yeah, sure. Jesus says so. And the Buddha says so to some degree also. But it's just not realistic to say they should or shouldn't. It's just academic, it's all just, thought games. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. And this one's kind of peculiar. This is from Austin. And Austin says, there is a logical synonym. Let me start over. There is a logical syllogism by the Dignaga school that goes like this. Premise 1, only what is causally efficacious is real. Premise 2, to be causally efficacious is to produce an effect at a particular time. Premise 3, something eternal would be unchanging. Premise 4, an unchanging thing would have no reason to produce an effect at one time rather than another. Premise 5, therefore nothing eternal could be causally efficacious. Conclusion, hence, no existing things are eternal. So that's the syllogism. And then Austin continues here, nirvana and samsara are considered eternal and uncaused in Buddhist thought. How can this be reconciled with the syllogism? Well, some of the syllogism I would agree with. Let's see. Like premise 3, something eternal would be unchanging. Yeah, I would agree with that from a Buddhist point of view. Premise 4 seems pretty solid. An unchanging thing would have no reason to produce an effect at one time rather than another. Yeah, I mean, how could something that doesn't change cause anything? But getting up to premise 1, I think this is really the Achilles heel of the whole syllogism. Premise 1 says, only what is causally efficacious is real. And that seems like an arbitrary premise that it's just not really self-evident to me. You could say that what is real would not be causally efficacious. Like, what does nirvana cause? If we say that nirvana or Brahman from an Upanishadic point of view is ultimate reality, then I mean, what does that cause other than just serving as maybe as a kind of ground of being? You know, it's the uncarved block that gets carved into an infinitude of imaginary statues. So yeah, I would say that premise 1 is problematic. Only what is causally efficacious is real. Yeah, I think that is just like an arbitrary idea that isn't necessarily true. I mean, if you could prove that that is true, that's fine. But I think that since premise 1 is problematic and not self-evident at all, then it just causes it causes the conclusion to be, I mean, it could be validly deduced based on the premises, but it's not necessarily true at all. And then you get to the end here where he's saying nirvana and samsara are considered eternal and uncaused in Buddhist thought. Not necessarily. Samsara is not uncaused, because going with dependent co-arising, at least the traditional formulation of it, samsara is caused by ignorance, avijja. Avijja is causing samsara moment by moment. So nirvana would be eternal and uncaused, but samsara would not, according to my understanding of Dhamma. So I'm just going to move on to Austin's second question here. In classical Buddhism, is consciousness ontologically identical to, distinct from, or dependently arisen from the physical body, and how do they interact causally? Okay, so in classical Buddhism, consciousness is distinct from the body. You know, according to Abhidhamma, which I assume would qualify as classical Buddhism, you've got 4 ultimate realities: mind, mental states, matter, and nibbana. So that mind or consciousness is qualitatively, radically, completely different from matter. So it would be distinct from the physical body. But when you get to how do they interact causally, I don't think Abhidhamma really has a good answer for that. I mean, like Mahayana Buddhism has an easier answer, because most Mahayana Buddhists are philosophical idealists. They don't even believe that physical matter is real. So, I mean, that just kicks the mind-body problem right in the head. You no longer have a problem. Let's see here. But, I mean, with regard to, like, Abhidhamma, how do they interact causally? I don't think there really is much of a, like, how it works. It's just like, it's just accepted as a fact that it has to work. And there are certain things like kamaja rupa, where you've got physical matter that is somehow created by karma, which is a mental state. So there is like an interaction, like a relationship between mind and matter, but Abhidhamma really doesn't do much, as far as I know, to actually explain how that happens. So, I mean, being like a philosophical idealist just solves the problem, just cuts through the Gordian knot immediately. So, I think I'm just going to move on to Austin's third question here. If consciousness is not reducible to the physical body, how does it condition a new existence after death in classical Buddhism? Well, it's like, how does it condition a new existence? I mean, the only thing that moves from one life to the next is karma, and it looks like I'm not lagging right now. Or if I am, it's very little. So, let's see, if consciousness is not reducible to the physical body, which it is not, how does it condition a new existence after death in classical Buddhism? Well, the way it works in classical Buddhism, at least like Orthodox Theravada, is at the moment of death, the very next moment, the momentum of your mind, your karma, your chetana, your will, in the Schopenhauerian sense, it has to continue existing because it hasn't like dissipated yet. It's it's still the force of ignorance and delusion and whatever is just keeping it going, and so it just has to like inhabit a new body. It just jumps instantaneously from this dying dead body to this like fertilized egg, in the case of a human or like an organic organism on this planet. So, for example, with regard to like how a new being takes rebirth in a woman's womb, there have to be the man and the woman coming together. There has to be a certain amount of moisture. And also there has to be the gandhabba, which is interpreted as this karmic momentum, which is just has to enter the fertilized egg. And so according to Orthodox Theravada, rebirth happens at conception. Personally, I'm a little skeptical of that, but I mean, how is a fertilized egg going to contain the karma of a complex adult, who was someone who was a complex adult just moments before? That most of that, the sort of the anusias, the latent tendencies, are going to be extremely latent, for years, even several months at the very least. But again, I'm not a materialist, and just trying to drag the physical body into these equations is fallacious in my opinion. So, it's like mind conditions matter rather than matter somehow generating mind, which is more of the scientific attitude. So I'm just going to move on to this question. This is from Romeo. And Romeo's got kind of a somewhat of an autobiographical sketch here. And I noticed we're lagging again. This is so weird. Maybe it's just the computer is sleepy because it's well after midnight. In fact, it's after 1:30 in the morning now. So Romeo says, I live in New York City, where a Muslim democratic socialist, i.e. a communist, recently won the Democratic primary for mayor. Even though he still has to win in November, barring some miracle, it's pretty much a foregone conclusion that he'll be victorious. Mamdani winning will be yet another nail in the coffin of this city, I'm afraid. Anyway, members of a Buddhist temple I sometimes attend sent out emails strongly urging fellow attendees to vote for Mamdani. They said, quote, his plan for attending to those in need comes closest to embodying the Buddhist ideals of dana and loving kindness, unquote. Even though the head monk of this temple wasn't responsible for these emails, reading them made me feel like not returning to it. Politically contentious topics have come up there before, so the Mamdani emails are merely the straw that broke the camel's back. Besides the fact that I disagree with them politically, I go to this temple for spiritual development, not political proselytizing. After all, one of the main things that drew me to Buddhism in the first place was its focus on the inner rather than the external world. Okay, so that's the autobiographical sketch setting us up for the questions. So the first question is, I know how important it is to accept things without resistance and realize that my thoughts are not returning to this temple that my thoughts of not returning to this temple are based in aversion, but forcing myself to hobnob with people who constantly push their leftist politics doesn't feel right intuitively. Should I go against my grain and tough things out and continue attending this temple, trying to be as accepting and non-judgmental as possible, or go with my gut and go the path of the horn of the rhinoceros? So I assume it will depend on how much benefit you're getting there compared with how much detriment you're getting there. So if you're getting more benefit from going there than the detriment, and you should separate the detriment that you're getting from just aversion that is sort of volitional. I mean, you could use your aversion for these communist Western Buddhists as just something to work on. You know, it's like you've got aversion for this, you know, you still have this uncooked seed. So, I mean, you could just be friendly and accepting and, you know, just have a little compassion, I guess. And I mean, so long as they're not just getting in your face and calling you a fascist and all that. I mean, even then, I mean, you could still use that as a spiritual practice and just like return blessings, you know, bless those that curse you, that sort of thing. But I mean, if you're not really up for that, if that's just too advanced practice, then yeah, you might just avoid the situation. Like resisting temptation or resisting bad reactions to a certain stimulus by just avoiding that stimulus, that's kind of a shabby way of dealing with the situation. But for a beginner or for someone who just isn't ready yet, then that may be what you have to do. And the Buddha did, like, he did recommend that, you know, it's like you just avoid the temptation as a way of resisting the temptation more easily if you're not so sure that you can resist it. But I mean, you could use it as a kind of spiritual practice. And even if there is a certain amount of aversion, if you are getting more benefit from going there than you would from not going there, I mean, that's something that only you would be able to decide, that I wouldn't really know. Let's look at here. Okay. So, yeah, I mean, it would be sort of like just write out a balance sheet, you know, formulate an equation with, you know, is it you're getting or in the black or in the red by going there overall. And really, I mean, just being nice to like hysterical leftists who might just freak out if they knew what your real beliefs were. I mean that's one of the best things you could do spiritually. As a general rule, like even on like X, I'll do a bit of trolling on X. I used to be on minds.com, but now, I mean, X has pretty much taken over with regard to freedom of expression. You have a much larger audience with X anyway. You can, you know, have more access to more points of view, I guess. But still, I mean, you got somebody calling you an idiot and a racist and a fascist and all this. As a general rule, I don't just like respond with, you know, just invective going the other way. It's like, you know, just address their accusations, you know, or just, you know, just remain civil and just continue. And really that's the best way to go about it, I suppose. But again, I mean, I doubt that Romeo here is just being confronted by hysterical leftists accusing him of being a Nazi. So, yeah, I mean, you're just going to have to decide for yourself. I mean, in my case, if there's a lot of, gay pride retreats and just sort of sexual deviants flaunting their sexual deviance at the meditation center, that sort of thing, yeah, I think I might stop going there. But if it's more kind of subdued than that. But you could just do the honest civil responses to those emails, and then you might just get kicked out, and then you wouldn't have to make the decision. If you want to, you could do a little bit of spiritual, polite, compassionate trolling. Just at the Q&A session, it's like, what about if you support Trump? That sort of thing. But really, you are the one who knows whether you would get more benefit from going or not going. And so you're just going to have to work that out, because all I know about the situation is what you've written in a few paragraphs here. So I'm just going to move on to Romeo's second question. Are these temple attendees correct that socialism or communism comes closest to what the Buddha prescribed? Well, again, it's sort of like in Christianity too. Like an advanced saint would probably just, a community of advanced saints like Arahats would just automatically be anarcho-communism, because there's no concept of I, me, mine. There's no possessiveness, no competitiveness, so there's no ambition, anything like that. So yeah, for like very advanced beings, something like communism would come closest to what the Buddha prescribed. But for most people, it just doesn't work that way. Also, there is one kind of weird sutta in the Digha Nikaya where the Buddha is saying that crime is caused by poverty and that kings should subsidize farmers by giving them all the seed grain they need to get started running their farm, that kind of thing. So technically in the suttas, there is some support for sort of a proto-paleo socialism to some degree. But yeah, the Buddha really was not prescribing much in the way of normie politics or normie economics. There's that one sutta in the Digha Nikaya which is kind of questionable because it deviates so far from what the Buddha is usually saying in the suttas. But yeah, whether the Sangha of monks would even be socialistic or communistic. It's a radical democracy where you need consensus. Everyone has to agree on any like formal act of the Sangha. One monk at the monastery, he could be the most junior monk there. He could have been ordained just that morning. If he says no, then it's no. Everyone has to agree. So, that can work in a monastery, but it's certainly not going to work in a national government. Nothing would ever get done. You'd always have some people disagreeing. So, some of the Buddhist teachings would be more of, it'd be more capitalistic, but not with regard to economics. It's just like, he's not trying to enlighten everybody. It's just the elite, the spiritual elite who are ripe for it. Those are the ones he's mainly helping. He's helping the others, just the normie, like villagers, the householders who enjoy pleasures of the senses. He's helping them a little, at least getting them kind of going towards the light instead of towards the darkness. But the ones he's trying to save, to liberate, trying to help them to liberate themselves, it wasn't any kind of, like socialized enlightenment. And that's mainly what he's teaching. Dukkha and the cessation of dukkha. That's like what the Buddhist teachings boil down to. And it wasn't for everybody. It was for a kind of spiritual elite. So, yeah, communism is just sort of like standardized mediocrity in a way. And that wouldn't be what the Buddha was teaching. With regard to like helping people, it's really a false dichotomy to say that you either socialize like food stamps and like welfare, that kind of thing. You have a welfare state, or just you just let people starve to death and don't give a shit. I mean, that's a false dichotomy, because you can have private charity. You know, like it was churches and church groups that were taking care of the poor for over 1,000 years. They might not have done a really great job everywhere, but then again, the government doesn't either. So I think that private charity is better, because you're actually gathering up treasures in heaven. I mean, you're doing good by helping the poor, much more so than if the government is just automatically, or your boss or whatever, is automatically deducting income tax from your pay and then using that to fund like a bureaucratic welfare state. The only good karma you might get would be like when you're voting in favor of it, that kind of thing. Or you're just sitting there feeling good about all the taxes you're paying, that some of that is helping people. But the Buddha really was not a politician. So he really wasn't teaching economic systems. I mean, in the ancient Ganges Valley, you had sort of like oligarchic republics that were on the decline, and you had like militaristic, like imperialistic kings were like in the ascendant. And eventually, not too long after the Buddhist time, you had almost all of India united under the empire of Magadha. And so, I mean, certainly the Buddha would recommend that kings be benevolent, but he was talking, I mean, it was mainly autocracy was just the default political setting in the Buddhist time, other than sort of some of these oligarchic republics that were in decline. Like the oligarchic republic from which the Buddha himself was allegedly born, Kapilavatthu, like a city-state of Kapilavatthu, they were just wiped out, and just really not very long after the Buddhist time. So compassion, you can say compassion is important, but I mean, to what extent is socialism or communism really compassionate when, as I say, you're just getting money automatically deducted from your pay, or from you buy something at the store, there's a sales tax, that kind of thing. And I mean, it's not a volitional act at all. You're not helping anybody volitionally. It's just automatically that this money is being siphoned off to some bureaucracy where they're pretty much helping people sometimes. So yeah, this is kind of a trick question, I think. So I'm just going to move on to Romeo's third question here about Mamdani. Mamdani embodies the so-called red-green alliance of radical leftism and Islam. You have previously cited how the Muslims wiped out Buddhism in India in the distant past, and I am fairly sure that Islam's essential view and treatment of Buddhism and Buddhists hasn't changed much since then. But what has occurred when Buddhism has encountered communism or socialism, especially in other parts of the world? Well, I mean, you can just look at 20th century history, early 21st century history with regard to Buddhist cultures that got taken over by Marxism, for example. Well, you got China, which, I mean, most Marxist governments will just ban religion. China allows a little bit of religion so long as they got pictures of Chairman Xi on the wall, and you know, it's not really spiritual. It's just for like tourists to go and see the Shaolin temple and that kind of thing, as a general rule. Then you got like Cambodia. We know what Pol Pot did to the Sangha in Cambodia. You had in Burma, you had socialism under U Ne Win for a while, which failed utterly. But I mean, at least then it was like a Buddhist socialism, because the government was sort of like the mafia, where, you know, the mafia in America are at least outwardly to some degree Catholic. You know, they're not gonna shoot a nun probably. And so it's sort of like that in Burma, where the generals, the military dictatorship, they did have a certain respect for the Sangha, unless the Sangha was like denouncing the military dictatorship or protesting against the military dictatorship, then the monks might wind up in a prison cell or worse. But just sort of ostensibly, the government did endorse Buddhism, even though it was socialistic, but it was like an incompetent socialism. But as a general rule, communism or socialism, like in the guise of Marxism, has a dim view of religion. You know, they're trying to replace religion, which is like superstition, with the gospel truth of Marxism, which is just more superstition. But I mean, it has sort of worked, at least. Like Vietnam is communistic, and I do think that they tolerate religion. I don't think that the Vietnamese government has just flat out banned religion. Certainly not just like working monks to death in the fields like the Khmer Rouge did. So I mean, it is possible that you could have like a Marxist or socialist government that is tolerant of religion. But I think I better just move on to the next question. And it's like almost 2 a.m. here. it's gonna be well after 3 by the time I'm done, I think. And Philalethes has asked a transgressive 4th question. Shame on Philalethes. Philalethes' name is going on a list. Although it could be that this first question is just a rhetorical one. Philalethes says, did James really get outcompeted by Paul? How do we know this? That's incredible. And I think I was mentioning this in a video. Could even be